Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I hope that you've had a wonderful week. I'm sure that, like me, you're a little tired and you've been at it, but I'm really happy to see you. And it's been such an exciting week for us in class, as always, that I was really ready to get back into the classroom or our digital Zoom environment. And it's very good to see you all as you make your way in. Oh, thank you so much for the birthday wishes. I really appreciate it. Yes, Brittany, there is an assignment link on Cat Courses already for the essay. It's been available since this morning. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. That's so sweet. It's really, really nice. And I was actually just saying earlier that I've spent so many birthdays alone, either like on other continents or just in grad school or whatever, that it's really nice to finally spend a birthday with family and loved ones. So all that was worth doing, but spending time with loved ones is really what it's all about at the end of the day. So I'm very happy, and my parents are actually here, as I mentioned, and of course I'm with my wife, and yeah, we're just really, really happy to be together, and it's been wonderful. But it's been great to be in here too. And this week I've been teaching you about non-electoral political behavior, and we've been using the example of India. And we've been talking a lot about riots and uprisings and violence, and especially intergroup violence. So those cases where ethnic or religious majorities wage violence or abuse minorities. And in the case of India, it's a Hindu majority and a Muslim minority. And we talked about the religious riots in India and how there have been approximately 100 in the past 100 years or so, before and after independence. And generally speaking, these are quite vicious. And just in the year 2012, as you'll recall, there was significant variation from state to state, but in total, 640 individual riots and 93 fatalities just in that 1 year alone. There is considerable variation from state to state. India is a federal state, meaning there's a distribution of power between the central government and state and local governments. These individual states all have their own legislatures, governors, courts, etc. And there's all this variation and a lot of questions about how India can overcome intergroup violence in pursuit of full democratization. It's a significant obstacle to democratic consolidation. And we talked a lot about how different theories that are often used to explain ethnic or religious violence, how they don't work. And those include arguments that emphasize declining state capacity or changes in the degree of consensus democracy or consociational democracy. These sorts of arguments don't work because they imply that there should be a similar level of ethnic violence throughout the country, but instead there's significant variation. What we talked about instead on Wednesday is the role of the level of party competition. And we talked about how, in particular, two parties or two major parties and no significant minority parties can translate into the government not relying on minority votes and consequently not preventing riots. It can be very different, on the other hand, where there are three or four parties in the system, and minority parties in particular are included in the competitive parties who have seats in the legislature. In these situations, the government is more likely to rely on that minority party and its voters for support. And so in this case, governments are more likely to prevent riots. This is a very nuanced and interesting theoretical explanation of the variation in intergroup violence and also the role of the government in protecting minorities and preventing riots, because it plays on very well established and recognizable assumptions about the interest of elites and political elites in political survival, especially governors or leaders or executives, the role of party competition in changing the incentives faced by those elites. It talks about the important role of fragmentation in shaping the overall incentives faced by the different actors. And the reason I chose this reading is because it does all those things, and it plays on all those very recognizable themes that many of you in comparative politics and political behavior and mass political behavior will recognize. And many of us, even in other fields, will recognize these ideas too. And so for this reason, the Wilkinson reading is really useful, and it's a very intuitive argument and approach. Now, what I have in mind today is a set of simulations or a kind of set of dilemmas that I'm going to present you with. And these are basically scenarios that put you in the driver's seat and give you information that you will use to make a decision about how to proceed. And without further ado, let me present you with the first scenario. And I'd like you to just kind of step back and pause for a moment here, because we'll spend a good amount of time thinking about these scenarios before we respond and engage with them. But what we'll be doing is kind of simulating non-electoral political behavior in different political environments. And the main differences will be in the level of party competition. And I'm going to present you with this first scenario where we have essentially a two-party system. We have an effective number of legislative parties of about 2.5. It's basically a two-party system for all intents and purposes. And the scenario is this: you are a leader of a minority group whose political party does not have any representatives in your state's legislature. Rumor has it that the majority group plans to attack your group's citizens and property. There is disagreement within your group about how to defend itself. Now, here's where the dilemma arises. Some group leaders advocate a strategy of lobbying the state's governor to use state resources to protect your group from any outbreak of violence. But other group leaders advocate a strategy of forming a group self-defense force. Now, your support for one strategy or the other will determine the group's course of action. Now, my question for you is, whose strategy do you support? The lobbyists or the civil defenders, and why? I want you to take a moment and think about this information. Think about the scenario, think about the political environment, and then respond to this question in a message to me. And I'll field your responses, and we'll sort of go along, and I'll eventually rejoin the class and we'll address this, and we'll talk about this scenario in the set of choices available to you. But please indulge me and begin to tell me your responses in a message. Keep them coming, everybody. I'm interacting with your responses. Inevitably, there will be quite a few of you who come in at once, and I'll get a little bogged down, but I'll do my very best to engage with you. And so, please use this as an opportunity to interact with me, and I'll interact with you. Keep them coming, everybody.
I have a question.
Yes, Edna.
Is there a correct answer to this, or is this just
There is a correct answer.
okay? Thank you.
So we're getting a lot of contributions. Many of you are saying that you would support the lobbyists, but I'm telling you that that may not be the best decision. Does anyone want to talk a little bit about why supporting the lobbyists may not be the best approach, even though it may seem like the most peaceful or benign?
Because the government has no reason to listen to you because you don't have any representatives in the state legislature or a part of the coalition. So you have no proof that supporting you benefits the government electorally.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I also just wanted to add that if it is like an authoritarian style government and like we don't have any say, it would be more useful to, I guess, revolt or have some sort of like power this way, because if they're not going to listen to us and they're not going to work with us, there's really nothing we can do in that approach.
So let's work with the assumption for hypothetical sake that it's a functioning democracy and that the level of party competition measured in terms of the effective number of parties, that it's a relatively good indicator of the that aspect of the democracy. So assuming that it's a functioning democracy, does anyone want to dispute the argument that Ishan made that the government just won't listen to you? Does anyone disagree with that? Will someone disagree with that? I know that most of you do, or excuse me, I can't speak for most of you, but some of you do, or that many of you initially had a different viewpoint. So what's the best argument for taking the approach of lobbying the state's governor?
The argument I made, which I mean, I changed my mind, so like I'll just like tell you what I said, but it was that it's like a proactive strategy instead of a reactive strategy, and that the state might be more open if they didn't approach the situation with violence.
Right on. Yeah. So that actually is like one of the best arguments for nonviolent social movements, that you gain legitimacy and that you can expose the repression of the state. And so, in a lot of different other scenarios, that would be, a winning argument. And that would be but it's a valid argument no matter what. But there may be an element, like a political component, right? A strategic element that is at play here that should be considered as well. And Edna, you're being very admirable in mentioning that you changed your position and that you thought about, the potential fallout or the potential, the lack of effectiveness maybe of the strategy that you had originally chosen. But as many of you are pointing out, the peaceful approach could be better for that reason. But some of you are suggesting that might need to be considered alongside this political or this strategic factor. And I'm continuing to field some of these responses, and permit me to take a moment here to read. I'll rejoin you in just a second. So Arlene made a really interesting point and said the civil defenders would probably be the better option because there is no guaranteed protection of the minority group. And that lack of guaranteed protection comes from what? It comes from the fact that, well, with only two main parties, the government doesn't need your votes to be reelected. The party in government doesn't need your votes to be reelected because your political party doesn't have any representatives in the legislature, and by definition, your party is a small, minor party. And in a system where there are only two major parties and only 2.5 parties have a realistic shot at winning, there's almost no chance that your party will be in a position to play kingmaker or deny necessary support or votes to the party in government. And so, although it's obviously admirable to pursue a peaceful strategy, and although under many other circumstances that might gain you legitimacy and that might validate your struggle and expose the repression or the abuse of an authoritarian regime, under a democratic regime, it's simply better to pursue some other means. If the political consideration in the political calculation doesn't support the government responding meaningfully to protect your group, you may need to pursue a self-defense force. Now, as always, everyone, we're exposing the unseemly parts of politics, right? The parts that are really, really uncomfortable. The fact that any person would be in this position and that anyone would choose not to protect a minority group because it wouldn't impact their political survival. But let's be realistic too. These are the choices that politicians face in a variety of circumstances in many, many countries where minorities don't enjoy full protection. These are political choices and political considerations. And this is a set of alternatives that individuals in positions of power face. And so keeping that in mind, this is a worthwhile exercise. It is worthwhile to consider how the number of parties or the level of party competition would affect the choices or the alternatives and ultimately the course of action that maybe your group would take. Now, I just want to reiterate then that the reason that it wouldn't be optimal to lobby the state's governor is because the party in government's reelection does not depend upon your support. The votes of your ethnic or religious group are not the deciding factor. The reason is because you are a minority party in a party system where only two major parties are really realistically competing to fill the legislature. In that environment, you don't have any political leverage, and the government's reelection does not depend upon your support. Therefore, it may be better for you to prepare for impending attack by forming a self-defense force. And maybe then that means that you should devote your resources to an alternative approach, one outside of those ordinary channels with the support of the state government or the security forces. And this is a moment where I'd like to ask anyone who's commenting or engaging or who's thinking about this problem to react or to respond to the conclusion or the upshot that in this scenario, the better strategy would be to form a civil defense force. I'm positive that that might not sit well with most of us or all of us, and that might still be a troubling conclusion. But is it clear how politically and on like a strategic level that is the course of action that one would need to take in this circumstance? Or does anyone still dispute the logic of this exercise?
I still think that, like, even if they form a self-defense force, they're still going to be outnumbered by the majority inevitably. So I don't know. It's not adding up for me.
So for you, Tessa, are you saying that they're not mutually exclusive? You can form a self-defense force and lobby the state's governor? Or
Yeah.
are you saying that you still think that the better strategy is forming a group self-defense force?
No, I'm criticizing forming the group self-defense force.
Oh, okay. So you think then that the best strategy is to just lobby the state's governor?
I don't like either option, but yeah. I don't know. Lesser of two evils. I don't know.
Okay, so let me just indulge me a little. So, but do you disagree though that the re-election of the party in government doesn't depend on the support of your group.
Yes.
So you do then see that.
Yes.
Okay. So in a truly sick, like nihilistic world where politicians have no principles, let's assume that the governor has no principles and is operating on this purely political basis, in that they'll make a decision based on what will affect their survival and what won't, and that they'll only do something if they have a rational reason for doing it, a need, like a powerful electoral reason for doing something.
Oh, okay, I see it. Yeah, I get it now.
Okay. Because remember that politicians are not like you and I. I mean, for the most part, they're really different. Like, it is true. Like, they're a lot, they often are kind of, they're opportunistic. They're not as guided by principle. They lack integrity. They're very calculating and shrewd and cold, and they operate in a way that is focused on maximizing their survival and their power. And they won't do something that will imply an expense that doesn't generate some benefit for them or some gain or that is not necessary. And so this is how we think about these politicians. And that might not be fair to them entirely. But in the case of India, Wilkinson finds that this does appear to be the logic of you know state protection of minorities against violence. I'm glad we had this talk. This is always a useful exercise because we have to confront, our our ethical and our moral constitution. And as people in society and not in politics, we have that, right? And we then have to think about how politics might affect decision making for those people who are in politics. And that doesn't include us yet, but some of you may aspire to do that. I suggest you read Machiavelli if you haven't yet. So Kyrie says, can you give an example of a civil defense mechanism? So in Mexico, there are some communities that form what are essentially civil defense forces. These are like voluntary, non-official defense forces of people in the community who take up arms and coordinate their activities to try to protect the group. And they don't rely on official support because they can't trust the police or the security forces, who are often corrupt and maybe bought off by drug gangs. This is analogous in some way to what you might think of a minority group in India doing, or a religious group, or Muslims in a place where they're persecuted. You can imagine them taking up arms and forming a self-defense force because they don't trust the security forces or the police, and especially if the party in government doesn't rely on their support, and if the number of parties is very low, and minority parties, including theirs, don't have any representation. So that would be an example. Chandon says, I see why we should go with civil defenders, but wouldn't getting more public support be better? Like, if we have more media coverage, we can get support, and then we can also get a self-defense force. Absolutely, Chandon. And in an ideal world, we would intervene and we would generate more support, right? And we would maybe win, elections and get more seats in Congress or the state legislature. And that is often the best route in the long term. But in the short term, this is often the situation that minority groups find themselves in, where they don't have formal representation and where they're very wary of falling back on the state, either because the state is in the hands of a rival group or because they lack representation and they fear that the state doesn't need their support to survive and therefore won't protect them. And so I think for hypothetical purposes, it's useful for us to place ourselves in this scenario and just consider that, well, if we don't have that legislative support, and if this is the nature of the political environment and the balance of forces, and this is the level of party competition, what should we do in this situation? Assuming that leaders have no integrity and no principle, in that the governor in particular will only operate on the basis of political survival. But I do agree, Chandon, that long term we would want to generate more support, right? And we would want to produce a strategy that might be more useful and help us to shape our fate in the long term, and maybe save us from needing to fall back on some of these strategies. But the thing about self-defense forces that's neat is they exist throughout Latin America too, and especially in places in Central America and in Mexico where the police and the security forces are corrupt or bought off and can't be trusted. So we're going to do a new scenario, and the situation is different only in one regard. Now we're in a four-party system. So this means that four political parties all have a realistic shot at winning seats or getting a sizable presence in the legislature. The effective number of parties in this scenario is 4.5. And again, we're considering non-electoral political behavior, and in particular minority strategy in a four-party system where the effective number of parties is 4.5. And so this is the circumstance. You are a leader of a minority group whose political party has a sizable presence in your state's legislature. Rumor has it that the majority group plans to attack your group's citizens and property. There is disagreement within your group about how to defend itself. Here's the dilemma. Some group leaders advocate a strategy of lobbying the state's governor to use state resources to protect the group from any outbreak of violence. Other group leaders advocate a strategy of forming a group self-defense force. Your support for one strategy or the other will determine the group's course. So again, you're in a position to basically decide what the group will do in order to try to defend itself. And so whose strategy do you support? Do you support the lobbyists or do you support the civil defenders? And I'd like you to take a moment and think about this. Think about the circumstances. Think about the information that I gave you, and then respond in a message to me with whose strategy you would support and then your reasoning. Keep them coming, everybody. I'm interacting with you, and responding to your response. And we're doing a good job. Good, Marilyn. Absolutely. That's really good, Arlene. Yeah, that's really good reasoning. I like too that you engaged with both of the alternatives and talked about the potential costs of pursuing that other alternative, even though the first alternative that you listed is clearly a better option. No problem, Lila. I know that technology and internet connections can be a little inconsistent. Yeah, that's the change, Lila. That's the change. That's right, Kyrie, but I think your assumption is right. So it is likely that those other parties are in a similar position, and so you can mutually share the influence, right? As many of you are discovering through your reasoning and your work on this problem, the political environment matters a great deal, and the strategic context really matters and shapes the incentives of the leaders. And sometimes discovering this in this way is monumental because you see then that although we can only ever act in a given moment in time, we can change the system so that the politics might create more opportunities for us. And so that's what you notice when you go from a party system that's 2.5 to one that's 4.5. And you notice then that once a minority party gains a larger presence in the Congress, and once the legislative vote is dispersed among a larger number of parties, the game changes completely. Even if the formal institutions are the same, suddenly the dispersion of the vote, the fragmentation of the vote, means that the government, the executive, the party in government, very likely needs the support of your party in a coalition. And that means then that you've got leverage, right? And that they need your support to be reelected or to stay in power or to govern. That's an essential source of leverage. And I'm going to give those of you who are still engaging a chance to continue talking and reflecting on this because there's a lot here. And although it may seem a little obscure and in like there's a lot, this is something that we can actually discuss at length because there are a variety of different points to make about what the different alternatives would lead to. And if you chose this strategy versus this strategy, Arlene said, for example, that if you choose the wrong strategy in this circumstance, it could lead to a lot of waste and unnecessary expense. That's an interesting point because it shows that in politics, there's a right and a wrong strategy, and the wrong one can be wrong for a lot of reasons, and not just political reasons, but for human and physical reasons too. And so I'm going to continue engaging with you. We've got more time, but give me just a few seconds to come back. We've got a few new contributions in the chat that I want to respond to. Good, Alexa. Absolutely. So let's hear it from someone who can explain it for us. Whose strategy should we support? The lobbyists or the civil defenders? And why? Does anyone want to take the mic and explain their reasoning?
I can go ahead. I said it would be more beneficial to support the lobbyists in this case because now that it's a four-party system, you can, I guess, build coalition within the government with the other minority parties and build a leverage because they now need your vote. And so yeah, I think that would be a better strategy than civil defense because seeing as they need your vote now, it's something that you can, leverage.
Totally. Then that's what politics is all about, right? Give me a lever long enough and I'll move the world. And in this case, that lever is your votes. And your party has a sizable presence in a in a legislature where the legislative vote is fragmented. And the government in this case relies on the support of your party to govern and will rely on the votes of your party's constituents to be reelected. Precisely because the effective number of parties, the level of party competition is higher, and precisely because those minority parties are now important components. They have a real strong or competitive position within the legislature because of the higher level of party competition. Now, that's really good reasoning, Kyrie, and that's what I was hoping I could bring you all to conclude. And we did by and large conclude that. And what we noticed is that the government needs your votes. The legislative vote is fragmented, your party has a sizable presence, so you can use that leverage to extract a promise of protection from violence. You don't need to form a self-defense force. Instead, you can use the political environment itself and take advantage of that level of party competition in your political position to extract a promise of protection from that violence and potentially prevent that riot. Now, there's another layer of this, though, and that is what would happen if you chose to form a self-defense force? Arlene suggested that, well, that would be misguided because you could actually end up with a loss of human life and it would be very costly. And to engage in that kind of a struggle would be very, very damaging and harmful to the group. And in this case, it's obvious that a political solution and a political approach is possible. Now, of course, we're again assuming that politicians and in particular governors and executives operate on the basis of political survival, and that instinct and that intuition above all motivates their decision making. And in this case, we assumed that to be the case as well. Some of you may disagree with those assumptions, but Wilkinson found that in India, the level of party competition matters a great deal precisely because of the way that it changes the incentives faced by political leaders who do appear to be, for all intents and purposes, quite political and quite motivated by the imperative of survival above all else in the instinct to rational behavior. So this is a useful discussion because we're talking about something that has an obvious implication for activists and for minority groups who do suffer persecution and who suffer violence and abuse at the hands of majorities in India or elsewhere, and frankly, everywhere. And I think that sometimes the implications get lost in our discussions about theory and analysis. We forget about the practical importance of what we study in our conclusions. And in this exercise, I think that it's useful for us to stop and think about, what does this suggest minorities should do? And does it suggest, for example, that they can afford to be politically disengaged, or does it suggest that they should pay more attention to politics? Does it suggest that they should try to alter the level of party competition? Does it suggest that they should be open to, potentially forming a self-defense force if they can't alter the level of party competition? What does this require of minorities if it's true that the level of party competition will determine their most optimal strategy? Do you think then that they should be engaged in politics, generally speaking? We're nearly out of time. And, I think what I'll do is I'll just make a few comments. The level of party competition clearly determines the best strategy. It predetermines the best strategy. It's an example of how the system selects the best choice or best alternative because of the way the parts move and the assumptions. If we assume that governors and executives operate on the basis of political survival, and if their survival relies on your support, depends on your support, that suggests then that we should lobby them. But if they don't depend on our support, we should pursue some alternative course of action. And in that regard, the level of party competition determines everything. Maybe we can change that level, maybe not, in which case we'll have to make a decision based on the level at any given moment in time. But this suggests that minorities should be very much engaged in politics. They should be trying to change the level of party competition. They should be actively trying to fragment the legislative vote and contribute to the dispersion of the vote. They should be trying to divide those large major parties. Anywhere and everywhere, they should be trying to divide and conquer and parcel out those concentrations of power so that they can create sources of leverage for themselves. And this is really, really interesting for me because, I study political economy, and one of the biggest challenges is overcoming fragmentation in the dispersion of the vote. And in this case, fragmentation works to the advantage of those actors who otherwise might be abused by majorities who would lack an incentive to protect them from violence or not abuse them. And so it's really, really interesting and ironic that in this case, fragmentation would be a good thing. Normally, we would suggest that fragmentation works against the goal of democratic consolidation because it makes it difficult to push through difficult reforms. But in this case, clearly, it supports the goal of protecting minority rights and liberties. And so it's just really interesting how in practice and in reality, we can wind up with these counterintuitive outcomes or patterns, but that are entirely understandable when you think about the bigger picture. And then in the end, what I want you to leave with is the simple fact that this is possible in the first place because it's a federal system. When you have a division of power between the central government and state and local governments, you have different levels of political environments, and you have different political environments where the incentives can vary based upon the number of effective parties and the level of party competition. If you unify power in the central government, the strategy of the minority changes, and they've got to focus their efforts on lobbying the central government or forming a national self-defense force, because you're scaling up the scope of the activity and you're centralizing everything in a single central government. The point is that the institutions matter and can change the environment as well. Thank you everybody for being here and being a part of this as always. I think we did a really good job, and I really appreciate you working through this with me. I really, really like it when you change your mind and you can see the other side of a situation. And that really is the essence of learning. And so thank you for being a part of it and for participating and for learning. And I learned just as much here along with you. So thanks again for all the wishes as well. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And I'll see you on Monday.